Hey, what's going on? So, how are most genres actually fantasy genres? There's lots of genres out there. There's lots of different movies and stories and books, games and things like that. And they're called different genres. They're called sci-fi. They're called romance. They're called fiction. They're called crime drama, right? Or maybe like a spy movie or something like that. How are they all really fantasy genre or very, very heavily influenced by fantasy or have fantasy elements, even though they're not your straight fantasy? It's not your Excalibur, it's not your Hercules or Conan, it's not your Sword and Sorcerer, it's not those movies, but they're their own genre, but they're so influenced by fantasy that they're actually fantasy stories. So if you look at something like Star Wars, for example, it's supposed to be science fiction, but Star Wars is very, very fantasy driven. It's got a lot of fantasy elements, and half of Star Wars is fantasy. Like, I would agree that some of Star Wars, like half of Star Wars is science fiction. The other half is fantasy. Half of it is spaceships and light travel and faster light travel and all kinds of technology and things like that. Whereas but then there's the Force, then there's Yoda, then there's the Jedis, then there are the Jedi Masters, and there's the Emperor who shoots lightning out of his fingers. Fantasy. And then there's detective stories, right? And you would think detective stories, how is that fantasy? But Sherlock Holmes is a superhero. And because he has certain powers that other people don't have, he has the power of deduction. Now, ideally, the way they present this is anyone can develop the powers of deduction, but he develops it to such a degree that he's able to figure stuff out way more more advanced than anyone else could possibly even get close to it. He can look at these different, he'll notice these little clues based on what someone says or what someone leaves around, or some little dot on some wall or something like that will tell them who done it, who created, who committed the murder, or who stole the jewels or something like that. He's a superhero, and his superpower is deduction. He's able to figure stuff out, and it makes him the perfect detective. So there's that. There's just tons of it, and even Dune. Dune is interesting because Dune is about a story about mankind or people, kind, or whatever. It's 10,000 years into the future, right? And 10,000 years in the future, things are really, really different. People are on different planets, and there's the spice, and then there's all these different civilizations and stuff like that. But it strongly has a lot to do with fantasy because the main character becomes a Kwisatz Haderach, a supreme being. Basically, a supreme being is the same thing that they did in the Fifth Element. The supreme being, the fifth element was this thing like that. But he was the Quintess of the Rack. He was the Messiah, He had powers. He was psychic. He would be able to tell the future. He would know what's happening in other parts of the universe and things like that. And then there were the Bene Gesserit witches who you would speak in these, use the voice, and the voice was basically a command that they would compel people to do, and with his voice, just by commanding them to do it, they would have to do it. They'd be compelled to do it. And so there's just so much fantasy in that it just feels there's some sci-fi. The fact that it's 10,000 years in the future, the different societies, the guild navigators and the spaceships and stuff like that, the fact that it's in the future. But honestly, most of it is fantasy. The whole Messiah plot line and things like that makes it very, very fantasy. Even if you look at something like romance movies, a lot of them are very, very heavily fantasy based. Even though because there's a small, most romance movies are just so unrealistic that they're very fantasy based. If you look at something like Romeo and Juliet, which is okay, fine, that's a classic one, right? That one's a little bit realistic. That's a realistic story. That's something where people fall in love and then, they would do anything for each other and stuff like that. But most of romance movies are sort of like, they kind of like hype up the whole concept of romance and they just make it super cool and super romantic and it just super works out even though it's not supposed to. And what's interesting is that like in most people's experiences, people really don't experience that. It's so out of reality that it's got to be called fantasy. It's got to be fantasy. It's just such a just the plot line and everything like that. It was just the way it comes across and the way things happen. It just feels like this could never really happen. Maybe it could, who knows? Like things could just happen, but most of the time, most people's experiences, their experience with real romance is not like anything like someone's experience with fantasy romance, the kind you see on TV or read in the book. There's that. And there's just like so many other genres. Winona Earp, which is another one. It's a Wild West fantasy. There's just like so much of it. And it goes all the way back to just like, 10,000 Leagues Under the Sea and all that stuff like that. But there's just like so many other genres that have it. There's even the horror genre. The horror genre is mostly fantasy. I feel like it's so interchangeable. Like fantasy, like making something scary makes it horror genre. Putting monsters in it makes it horror genre. But if you look at something that like all the monsters in the horror movies are very, very fantasy based. So if you look at something like Halloween, or Friday the 13th, basically with like, what's his name? Jason Voorhees, right? Jason basically he's just completely not a realistic character. He's not really, it just couldn't, someone like Jason couldn't survive. He's not really a living being, He's like lives underwater and, he doesn't need to really survive. He's just this like creature sort of like, is a person, but he doesn't really need to like eat or like keep himself alive. He can be underwater for long periods of time. You can just like jump out of the river at like Crystal Lake, I think they call it, or something like that, where he's from. He's just not human. And that makes him a fantasy character. And the same thing with Nightmare on Elm Street. It's a guy who attacks people in their sleep and kills them in their dreams, and they actually die, a horrible death. And what's interesting about it, it's horror because they try to make it scary and there's a monster there, but just the concept of the whole idea of it is just very, very fantasy based. He's a fantasy character, just like dreamed up. Even something like fairy tales are mostly fantasy. Fairy tales are just so much fantasy where, you've got like wolves that are sentient and talk. You've got smart talking pigs. You've got like witches and Hansel and Gretel and the witch with the gingerbread house. That's just so fantasy based. And even something like Alice in Wonderland is very, very, very much fantasy. Just the whole story is like pure fantasy. She finds like she becomes big and small and finds this like queen who is really a card, and it doesn't make any sense after a while. It's obvious, just made up stuff that you tell to kids to, entertain them and stuff like that. And one of the main things I find that is very, very fantasy, and people like call it a superhero genre. And yeah, it's a superhero genre. I think like anything where somebody puts on a cape or a costume and goes out and fights crime, whether they have like superpowers or not, that's a superhero story. It's a superhero genre. But I find that like it's all really fantasy. Superhero powers are fantasy. They're basically magical. They don't explain how it works. No one knows. Even just like something like Daredevil, which was on Netflix recently. There's a few seasons. I don't know if they're making any more. It's really good. Daredevil on Netflix is like awesome superhero fantasy. But he's got basically fantasy powers. All of the powers, like anyone having powers, that's a fantasy element. That's basically magic. And they're not wizards because that's just straight up fantasy. You know, any wizard in any story, you put a wizard in it, it's fantasy. You put like even like Constantine, he's a urban fantasy wizard. He's in the cultists, he's a wizard, whatever it is, you know. He's an urban fantasy because you put a wizard in there, that's it. It's a fantasy right off the bat. This is like everyone's going to identify that as a fantasy because a wizard is always identified with fantasy, you know. But you know, like you know, it's not the only like it's not the only element that they put in fantasy. But yeah, but you know, like so you got Daredevil, right? And Daredevil he's got superpowers. Like every single superhero has the superpower element are fantasy elements. I mean, they're magic. They're not wizard magic, but they're magic. There are different kinds of magic. And I find that like even just your straight up fiction is very, very fantasy based. There's a lot of fantasy elements in plain fiction stories. If you look at something like the espionage, the spy genre, and you're looking at something like James Bond, right? James Bond is a fantasy character. No one like that could possibly exist in a realistic setting. It is a espionage fantasy. You know, they might call it fiction or spy fiction or whatever, but fiction is just not a story that's not true. Fantasy is when there are superpowers or some kind of magic or something like that. Like Excalibur is not a regular sword because Excalibur has powers. The Holy Grail, it's not a regular grail because it has powers, you know. But that's the thing about it is that like basically James Bond has powers. You know, he can pretty much survive. He can pretty much do everything that a perfect spy can do. You know, he fights, he knows how to shoot guns, he knows how to drive cars, he knows how to drive airplanes and like jets and like helicopters and all this thing. And he's like, and there's romantic stories in that. There's a romance undertone in the whole thing where he's super cool. And he could do it all while looking cool, while wearing a tuxedo or like a suit, whatever. And the story is just like, it's a fun story. I mean, who doesn't like James Bond? But it's complete fantasy. And I'm finding like just so many stories are fantasy. Even if you look at like comedies, a lot of comedies are fantasy. A lot of the Jim Carrey, who's a comedian, you know, Jim Carrey, a lot of his comedies are very, very fantasy. There's the Jim Carrey where he played the pet detective, very, very fantasy based. Like there was a lot of things in there that just wouldn't happen in real life, wasn't realistic. That was going on. There's just like so many other things, like even comedies, a lot of times, you know, it just gets so ridiculous. Like the plot lines get so outrageous and so ridiculous that they're just not in the real world. So I guess, you know, we're looking at fantasy is just sort of like augmented reality or things that happen that would never happen in reality, you know, and that's most stories are fantasy. Like most stories would never actually happen in reality. You know, reality is just a lot different. Like it's the difference between like watching a documentary and watching a made up thing. You know, so there's that. There's just so many things. And I just also think like now, even like supernatural and stuff like that, whenever there's monsters, they try to put like fantasy elements in it. And I think the reason is that like people love fantasy elements. People love fantasy. They love the whole fantasy genre. They love the elements, you know, but not everyone is into the whole medieval fantasy thing or the whole wizard urban fantasy thing. You know, they want to see different genres. They want to see different stories. They want to see a lot of different things that happen, you know, because you can get bored watching one certain genre. Even though urban fantasy is awesome and I love urban fantasy, I mean, after a while, it's just like you really do want to watch something else. Same with medieval fantasy. Love it. I think it's great. But after a while, I don't know, just the same medieval stuff. You just kind of want to watch something else. Like with Merlin, the series, it's not a great series. It's a great idea. And it's a great concept. And I really like what they did. But the fact that Merlin is still not a magician. He's still too young. And Arthur's not king yet. And it's just like, maybe when are they going to actually become king and magician? Like never, maybe. after like seasons and seasons, they're still not actually who they're supposed to be in the story, it gets a little bit like boring. It gets a little bit daunting. People want other genres, but they want their fantasy also. There's lots of this stuff like Battlestar Galactica, basically sci-fi, but there's always some fantasy element in it. I'm gonna say like even in Star Trek, right? The Vulcan mind meld was fantasy element. It's a fantasy element. The Vulcan mind meld is like it's a superpower the Vulcans have. It's a fantasy element, and I can't think of anything in. I mean, I'm pretty sure that like even Battlestar Galactica, the old Battlestar Galactica, there was some fantasy elements. The fact that like that one, the leader of the Cylons, like he was human, but he led all of these machines. Weird, and that's the same thing as movies like the Terminator. Very, very fantasy. Like, yeah, they make it they're trying to make it science fiction, but they also like kind of do have a few things that they don't really explain, like the time travel element in it. Like, is that anything? They really couldn't explain how they did it. They were just like, oh, there's just a way to do it and stuff like that. It's sort of like taking the reality, the story, and just putting it into the next level. Taking the story, making it like one level over, one extra level, making it weirder and pulling it, making it like more far out and more strange and more awkward and more different and just bend it to the next level. And I think that's why most other genres are very, very either heavily influenced by fantasy or are very, very like they have fantasy based, even though they're not really considered fantasy. And you would see now things that are on Netflix, just stories where, they would have spy stories, but the spy knows how to change shape and can change into other people. Like there's so much stuff that, I don't know, maybe because just people like that kind of thing. So people that are fans of, maybe not so much fans of urban fantasy or medieval fantasy, still like their other genre fantasy elements in the things that they watch. So let me know what you guys are thinking about this in the comments. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Like and subscribe, and I will see you guys in another video later. Take care.